Mike, I read in your first story at The Athletic that seeing All the President's Men in the movie theaters when you're in elementary school really sparked this interest in going into journalism. What do you remember just about the impact that movie had on a young Mike Silver?
Yeah, it was that and really a few things that went on around that time. The whole Pentagon Papers saga, which was later immortalized, decades later, um, in the paper about the movie about the Washington Post with Meryl Streep and Watergate. Obviously, I had followed the whole Watergate saga as a very young kid because we would take these family camping trips, usually in Northern California, sometimes Oregon, Washington, even British Columbia. And, my sister and I would just be in the back seat with my mom and dad in the front seat. And the Watergate hearings were a huge deal. And so I guess that would have been in 74. I'm guessing is when Nixon resigned. So that summer or 73. So I was either 8 or 9 or about to be 8 or 9. And my dad would have the Watergate hearings on and he'd be, talking at the people and, narrating. So I was already a total Watergate nerd just from exposure. And then, yeah, obviously that movie was so, back then, in the 70s and 80s, journalists weren't caricatures or evil, muckrakers in these movies. They were kind of heroic at times. And, that was obviously a cool movie with Redford and Hoffman, continuing to dig. And they were kind of this odd couple, but they, kept at it. And, there's some scenes I still think about today. I'll tell a story. I was at the Santa Rosa Press Democrat from 1990 to 94, first as a 49er beat writer and then as a columnist, though I also covered the Chris Webber Warriors on the side when he was a rookie because I worked a lot. But that was a New York Times owned paper, believe it or not. And it was, it was a cool paper. Santa Rosa, I didn't live in Santa Rosa, but it's like, more than an hour north of San Francisco and, kind of close to wine country. And after I had incredible beat writers when I was a columnist there, I had Mark Fainaru, who later, became obviously really consequential. And then eventually I had this guy, Brian Murphy, who has been like the morning radio guy at KMBR in San Francisco for decades now and is, really accomplished radio personality. But when I left Santa Rosa to go to Sports Illustrated, which we could get into, which was a very, precipitous jump. Does that work if it's not a fall? A very extreme jump. And I was still living in Oakland and now writing for SI and working at my dream job. And the 49ers I left late in the 1994 season. So they were about to win their fifth Super Bowl in that 14 season span, 13-year span. And, I was covering them a lot still and the Cowboys, obviously. And so a couple years after that, Brian Murphy got this incredible tip that he was later able to confirm. And it was George Seifert, two-time Super Bowl winning coach of the 49ers, 2 years removed from his second Super Bowl victory, and coming off another playoff appearance, was going to be fired out of nowhere and replaced by then first-year Cal coach Steve Mariucci. And that was like in the Bay Area, there was a lot going on. Like, what? And Brian Murphy called me because he trusted me and we'd worked together. And he said, dude, I heard this from one source. I think I gave him some phone numbers because I got excited. I'm like, here's Eddie DeBartolo's phone number, go for it. And now it's getting close to deadline because back then there were newspaper deadlines. And he calls me and he's kind of freaked out and he goes, dude, I don't know what to do. He goes, I got George. I go, you found Seifert? I'm like, he goes, yeah, I got him at one of those numbers. And he said, he was really weird. I told him what I heard. And he said, yeah, you better be really careful if you write that. You could be wrong. You could be very wrong. And he's like, I don't know what to do. And ultimately, I flash back to that scene in All the President's Men where they call John Mitchell late at night and he says, you're going to put that in the newspaper? And he says, you tell Kay Graham if she does that, I'm going to take her left tit and put it in a ringer, And they famously quote him. They went with the story and they quoted John Mitchell saying, I'm going to put Kay Graham's left tit in a ringer and it's part of history. So I think my advice to Brian Murphy was, if you've got it, you got it, quote him. And he did. And oh man, that next morning, I I went to the door as I usually did at 6 in the morning and picked up the San Francisco Chronicle. And when I was a beat writer, that was a horrifying walk to the front door because Ira Miller, the legendary beat writer, would kick my ass 7 ways till Wednesday, and I just wanted to see how bad it was. And then I started put on a couple of the local radio stations, and the report had come out and they were mocking it. I'm like, oh God. And, it wasn't anywhere except the Santa Rosa Press Democrat. And I get a call from Peter King, my close friend and SI colleague, and it's pretty early. It's still like 6:15 a.m. Pacific time. And he goes, hey, what can you tell me about this Brian Murphy story? And I go, dude, actually, I talked to him, I kind of know. And I'm like, I think he's got it. And he goes, I'm gonna have to make a few calls. I'm gonna call you back in a little bit. And, I'm just sitting there like, I can't imagine what Brian was going through, but I'm just like, oh God, I hope he's right. I hope he's right. Cause it's one of the biggest cold scoops, in my lifetime in the Bay Area. And the moment of glory was Peter King calls me back and he goes, I think this fucking kid Brian Murphy is right. And the rest is history. So but yeah, like there's some iconic scenes from All the President's Men that I still think about. And I do make that point a lot because people go, oh, you love sports, that's why you got into it. And I do love sports and writing about sports. And I grew up with a guy that we used to do Howard Cosell narrating American history together and get in trouble, and now he's the coach of the Warriors, so I get to tell those stories too. But I was definitely in all the sports conventions and all that, but I want to stress that I got into this for the journalism. I wanted to be a journalist, and there are a lot of advantages to writing about sports. Like if you cover politics, there aren't enough games. We got way more games.
Well, let's get to that first byline I found that I told you before we started broadcasting. The first one I found was May 3rd, 1987, Dateline Union City. This is for the Oakland Tribune by Michael Silver. The 1987 James Logan Invitational certainly lived up to its name. As you broke down the James Logan High's victory of a track meet. So, what were
Wow,
some of those
that's good.
those early internships, early jobs that kind of still resonate with you today?
Yeah, it's wild. I was hustling, and one of the things that we prided ourselves at the Daily California, and the Daily Cal, our college paper, was we got to go into the same press box and compete against all the Bay Area writers that were the real writers. So we felt like whereas college is so theoretical, like we were like, oh, we're actually going head up against them, and we thought we were better than we were, all of us, and we would read other college papers and mockingly out loud and make fun of how bad, like the Daily Brutal or the Daily Bruin, or the obviously the Stanford paper we had to crap on. But we would also read Rick Riley and Sports Illustrated and the LA Times and stuff and be like, oh my God, how could we ever be as good as Scott Osler and the LA Times? Like, these people are unbelievable. So we were like, and actually my co-sports editor at the Daily Cal and one of my friends and colleagues, Chris Reback, was a North Shore kid from Chicago, Chicagoland, and a New Trier kid, and he turned me on to Lincecum and Bob Valley and all the Chicago guys. And later I became like Rick Tellender is probably my you know uh, you know mentor and favorite human. But I got this great Chicago education early because of him. But we we felt like it was a badge of honor to, as columnists too, to be critical. We were like, and the players and coaches would get mad at us, and we're like, we're trying to make the pros too, and we won't be respected if we're like, go Bears, Cal Bears. Now I do that because I don't cover college, but at the time I was like, no, I'm trying to, and we had some bad football teams, and it turns out we had this run at the Daily Cal in my era of really good people. Like I just didn't know. I was like, shit, I hope I'm as good as like we had a bunch of people who made it in sports journalism. And then, one of my close friends and the guy who was above me is Mike Fleiss, who went on to create The Bachelor after he left sports writing. So he did okay. That Chris Reback, who I referenced, was like a 60 Minutes producer before he was 30, before he went into, I think, the financial world. And Ron Kroichik, who's still at the Chronicle, was there. Vic Tafer, I hired at the Daily Cal. Obviously, he's gone on to have an illustrious career. And there was a guy before all of us, named Pete Danko, that I used to read as a freshman before I went to the Daily Cal, who ended up being a columnist and then left the business. But I still argue that Pete Danko was the greatest of all of them. Like it was, it was unbelievable. But with all that said, we were trying to get after it. So yeah, we were trying to string and have relationships with the local paper if we could. I think I did a couple things for the San Francisco Chronicle. I know I did after college when I'd been a Newsday intern, and then I wrote some stories while I stayed back east for anyone who would take them, but a bunch for the Chronicle long before I would be employed by them in 2022. But the Oakland Tribune had a thing where they would take us on Friday nights for extra help with the prep call-in scores and the agate and all that. But we got to go into the Tribune Tower in downtown Oakland, into the Tribune newsroom, and make our $5 an hour or whatever, and be around it. And somehow they must have been in a real pinch one time and needed to cover a high school meet at James Logan High on a Saturday. But I apparently got that call. But yeah, I did have some pretty, the Daily Cal, we were able to experiment a lot, and some of it was absolutely failed in retrospect, and some of it was pretty cool. Try to find our voice. I would do crazy things. Like one time we just ripped up a page, and one of our photographers had taken a picture of these two seeming sorority girls at the Cal SC game in Berkeley. Looked like the quintessential SC stereotypical co-eds, and Cal got killed, and I just decided I was just going to run that picture big and do a mock conversation between the two of them in the stadium. And so, that either was a huge success or a major flop, but we would do crazy stuff like that. We had this whole shtick on Cal softball because they were constantly complaining that they were really good and not getting enough coverage. And we had 29 sports, and we were 5 days a week, but we couldn't cover everything as much as people wanted, and they would constantly complain. And finally, as the columnist and sports editor, I was like, man, so I started just mocking them all the time. And then the irony is that as as an alum, I started noticing they were like the most clutch, crazy program ever that would always, have the odds against them, pull off these miracle wins in the regionals, had terrible facilities, like feuding. It was just like a complete mess, but signified everything Cal is, with the diversity and the expression and the creativity. And I just got super into Cal softball, and now I'm like the dorkiest Cal softball fan. Like I've been to 3 Women's College World Series. I turned it into like a shtick at my Yahoo column. I tweet about it all the time. I constantly go to like a few years ago. I was at a game. I think it was a Cal Stanford game in Berkeley, which is not unusual for me. And I was Cal won dramatically, and I was getting really fired up. And one of the moms looked at me, and she's like, "Wait, who's your kid?" I was like, "No, I'm nobody. I'm just a fan. I am not a person." So anyway, uh, we did a lot of really cool things, and then I one of the crazy things that happened was there was this big scandal in the mid '80s where Al Campanis, the Dodgers' longtime general manager, was appearing on Nightline, which at the time was a very reverential show where Ted Koppel, for a half hour a night on national TV on ABC late at night, would take one story and dig into it with guests. And he was
Mm.
talking about the lack of minority representation in baseball in terms of managers and also GMs, but I think it was managers at the time. And he had Al Campanis on, and Al Campanis came off as kind of this old, befuddled guy. And at one point, he said, "Well, I think blacks lack some of the necessities to be managers." And Ted Koppel was like, "What? Like, isn't it the same garbage that we've been hearing?" And he didn't really double down. He just didn't really correct himself. And he got fired the next day. And it was a brutal end to a career. So, meanwhile, at Cal, the famed sports sociologist, Dr. Harry Edwards, who, engineered the Black Glove Salute in the 1968 Olympics and, a million other important civil rights things, I had taken his class, and he was on campus. And Major League Baseball, one of their quick responses was to hire Dr. Edwards as an advisor to the commissioner to try to help them through their racial problem. And he gave a press conference, and I somehow I grew up in LA reading the LA Times, which was incredible sports section. One of the reasons I probably got in the business. And I called up the LA Times sports editor, and I was like, "Look, I could get Harry Edwards. Al Campanis has been with the Dodgers. I'm like, if I get him, would you take a story from me?" And they were kind of like, "Well, let's see what you got." So I went. He didn't. Dr. Edwards missed the first interview. Something came up, and I had to just stand outside the door for an hour to his office, and I went back and got him finally. And one of the things he said was, "Hey, let's not shame Al Campanis. He said what's on a lot of people's minds in baseball. Let's educate him and them." He said, "In fact, I'm going to be hiring Al Campanis to work for me in my Major League Baseball capacity." So that was on the record. So the LA Times was like, "Cool, we'll take it." This was in the summer, and then I somehow called like Ross Newen or one of the baseball writers at the Times, asked him for Al Campanis' number, gave it to me, called Al Campanis, and got him on the phone talking about working with Dr. Edwards. So I had a follow up. So yeah, it was back. So the last thing I'll say about this is back then, you know, there was no internet, so the whole key was getting clips. You could be the greatest writer in the world, but if you weren't published with a printing press and a physical manifestation of your work, it didn't count. So, I couldn't have like handwritten out a hypothetical story and sent it in to try to get a job or an internship. I needed the clips. So we were always hustling. So I'm sure the Oakland Tribune, I'm sure the Oakland Tribune asking me to do that. I'm thinking, okay, maybe I can get a clip, even though it's a high school thing. There's one really funny story with in the Daily Cal where Steve Ketman, who later became a really good author and still a great author and newspaper guy, friend of mine who was older, the Cal swim team was really good, and they sent him to Indianapolis for the NCAA championships, which is pretty aggressive. A college paper sending a guy from, California to Indianapolis, and I think they finished second or third in the country. And he had back then you had to just call in your story. This was even before the bad laptop, so he had to like call in his story at on night deadline and dictate it. Um, and we had someone always working the night desk, and he was all excited because this was going to be a clip from Indianapolis with the byline. And the person taking the dictation, who was working night staff, may or may not have been mentioned previously, may or may not have gone on to create an insanely successful television franchise. And as legend has it, it may or may not have been high on anything from LSD to NorCal weed. It's all urban legend. But be that as it may, the word Florida was spelled, and Florida I think came in second or first. The word Florida was spelled Flordia, 27 times in this would-be clip. And when Kepman got home and ripped open the paper, he practically burst into tears. And yeah, then the stories became, yeah, I'm not sure if it was actually LSD, but it was a great story.
Was your first full-time job at the Santa Rosa Press Democrat?
No. So I had been an intern at Newsday in the summer of '88, which was amazing.
Mhm.
And for people who don't know, internships back then were often a direct pathway to jobs, and they were very substantial, and most papers had them. And so I was coming out of college, so I was applying to internships and jobs at the same time. And I went like 0 for 280, I mean, it was brutal. Like, uh, I remember, one sports editor of a real paper, like maybe the Kansas City Star level paper, just wrote me back this brutal letter, like, frankly, you are not up to the standard of our. I was like, dude, man, just kill me. But then it ended with, hey, if there's anything I can ever do for you, I was like, yeah, give me a time machine so I don't read this letter. But Newsday told me late, and I got it. So I went 1 for 281, but it was a great one to get. They let you do a lot, and they had an incredible staff, and they let me stay on in the fall doing high school stuff. And then I kind of drifted down to DC. I was temping, but I was also doing a bunch of stringing. I wrote the first story in a U.S. newspaper on 14-year-old Monica Seles, who blew up in this tournament in Virginia that I happened to be covering. And I talked the Chronicle into letting me write it, and got scoffed at by Steffi Graf when I asked a question at a press conference at that tournament. Something like, when someone's this young and doing this well, is it kind of scary? And she kind of gave me the, oh yeah, I'm very scared. I was like, oh my god, Steffi Graf just Fräulein forehand just destroyed me. But I was just doing that back east, and now it was like the next May. But Mike Fleiss, who uh, was mentioned earlier, had been hired by this now defunct paper called the Sacramento Union, which was, the second biggest paper in Sacramento behind the Bee, but a real paper. And he was a year ahead of me in college, and he had been working for them. And I think he'd been telling them, hey, there's another guy who's really good at the Daily Cal. You should get him. And lo and behold, I got a call like, hey, we have an opening to cover the 49ers. And I mean, I was 23 when I got the call. I was, I'd grown up a 49er fan in Los Angeles because I was born in San Francisco. And, you know, most of my childhood, I got clowned by all my friends. But then when I was 16, Joe Montana made them great. And I was still very much, they were coming off their third Super Bowl win of the 80s and about to win their fourth. So even though I was making like, the lowest possible salary that you could exist on, probably 20,000 a year or whatever, I was thrilled to get the call. And then I drove back across the country in my, in the old beat up Volvo that my parents had let me take out there. And um, on the way back, they wanted me to stop in Chicago, back to Chicago, because Bill Cartwright of the Bulls was an Elk Grove, California native, which is near Sacramento, and they said the Bulls are playing the Knicks. This is in 1989, and they said the Bulls are playing the Knicks in this playoff series. Go get Bill Cartwright and do a story on him. So this was old Chicago Stadium. This was the first big series Jordan won as an upset in the playoffs. The Knicks were favored, and I think the game I went to, they either won the series or tipped the series. Maybe they went up 3-1 or maybe they won it 4-2. I'd have to go back and look, but and Jordan, we'd sit courtside back then, and Jordan was, Jordan-esque, and so that was like on my way home, and then then I started covering the 49ers, and in that first season of covering them, in November, the paper got sold, and they made us all reapply for our jobs, and so a fancy way of saying I was laid off is I was not rehired. Neither Mike Fleiss and I were both not rehired on the same day, like late in 1989. And then I kind of had to, scrap, hustle, do some stringing, do some stuff for AP, and then finally got hired the next spring by the Press Democrat to cover the 49ers that next season. So the Sacramento Union, now defunct, but and we had this crazy coalescence of people in Sacramento back then, like on my staff and at the B. Scott Price was at the B, Mike Wise was at the Union, Bill Shaken. It's an incredible list of people who went on to be good. They got rid of Tim Kuhn, who was a part-time employee at the Union, who was young like me, to hire me, which after I started reading him, I was like, yeah, that was probably dumb. That guy's really good. But then he went to the B, and he obviously he's unbelievable. So I had a really good, the good news is I got to cover a beat, which, as you know, is the hardest thing in the world. And back then there were 12 daily newspapers, 3 of which doubled up. So 15 print guys in the press room every day covering the, defending or about to be 2-time world champions, back to back. And, I mean, Joe Montana, Ronnie Lott, Jerry Rice, and, a lot of residual greatness for me. Like Jeff Fisher was an assistant on one of those Seaford staffs, so I ended up being very close with him. Like I got really lucky, and it's funny because at one point somebody went and did a story on all the people from that era involved with the 49ers who fanned out to become successful in the NFL. And it was like John Gruden was the road ticket guy, and the coaches and the personnel people, and and I said to I was having drinks with Joe Montana years later, and I said, you know what, dude? I fucking rode your coattails just like everyone else. I'm like, I will admit it. I said, if I was covering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers of that era, I don't think I could get to SI. There was no internet. The Peter Kings and the Rick Rileys were coming in and reading my stuff. I mean, I happily will admit that I just got on that Joe Montana train like the rest of them.
May 27th, 1990, headline, Running Hills with Roger.
Ooh, good one.
And one of your first ones that comes up, which is really cool, thinking about you're still pretty early on in your career and you get to do this kind of stories. I'll read the lead for our listeners. Ever been terrorized by an anxiety dream? Chances are you've experienced some ugly nights of frustration, tests of mental endurance that leave you exhausted after 6 hours of sleep. And you kind of go, and I want to skip ahead to not the nut graph per se, but the crux here. Yes, my worst fears have been confirmed. I was running hills with Roger Craig. And the picture is here on the running trail with 49ers running back Roger Craig are, from left, tight end Jamie Williams, Craig, Ward Ferris, Press Democrat reporter Mike Silver, Jerry Rice, and David King. So, Mike, what stands out about how that all came to be? And was that a momentous, because I'm looking at this now, I'm like, how cool is this? You got to do this story. Was it kind of momentous in the moment?
Okay, well, first of all, I said 6 hours of sleep was bad, so you can tell that's before I had kids, and
Yeah,
my
there you
kids
go.
are now all in their 20s. But yeah, that like 6 hours of sleep. Once I had kids, I'd be like, sweet, I'll take that. So the hill was this. There was a lot of mystique about this hill in San Carlos. So it started with Walter Payton. Walter Payton used to have this amazing hill workout that was, you know, kind of credited with his incredible endurance and ability to, outlast everybody as a player. And he, in one offseason, had taken Roger Craig under his wing and let him run whatever Walter Payton ran with him. So that's how it started. So when I started covering the 49ers in 1989, Roger was a flat out superstar, and he was very much like, Christian McCaffrey and Marshall Faulk before them. He was the first thousand guy. He'd been a fullback at Nebraska, but was an incredible runner, but also that early Walsh offense would throw into the running backs out of the backfield. He was a force, and really, really, and Roger had always been great to me. Like very early on, I quoted him in one of those two papers saying, they're not committed to the running game the way we should be. Something pretty controversial. And listen, I was getting beat all the time. I didn't know what I was doing, but he said it, and he was Roger Craig, and he said it to me, and I went with it, and he got some blowback, and he kind of said something into the group that didn't quite shit on me, but shit on me a little bit, and I ha- I didn't tape much back then, but I did tape that. So I was able to like play the tape for someone and be like, "No, dude, he said it." And that day he like came off the practice field, found me, and was like, "Listen, man, I just panicked. I know I said it. I want to apologize to you." And it was like, so I was like, "Thank you, NFL superstar." So it was like, it was really cool. So Roger and I were always good. So I just said, "Dude, that hill workout, you know, do you think I could come check that out?" And he's like, "Check it out. Why don't you run it?" And I was like, I'm young. I was like, "Yeah." I was like, "Would you let us take a photographer?" And he's like, "Hell yeah." So we had it all set up. And the day that I did it turned out to be this important day because Roger had been goading Jerry Rice um, into trying to come work out with him for a long time. And Jerry Rice was already in 1990 being talked about as the greatest receiver of all time, but certainly considered the greatest receiver of his era by far already. That was coming off year 5 for him. So Jerry showed up that day, kind of surprisingly. They were like, "JR's here. Whoa." So I got to be there on the day that Jerry showed up. So now the way they did it is it's this long, steep uphill, and we ran single file together. And then once we hit the top, it was like, "Okay, go." Well, once it was okay, go, I didn't see Roger and Jerry again until I got to the bottom. Jamie Williams was the tight end, so I could kind of keep him, but it wasn't like I was running at their speed. But by design, on the way up the hill, we were in formation, the 7 of us. Now, our photographer, the photo they happened to use, weirdly, the biggest gap between any of the 7, and I think I'm kind of in the middle, is Jerry Rice behind me. Like, of
Yeah.
all the people, it's
Yep.
like everyone's about the same distance, but Jerry's way behind me. So this will give people an idea of the Jerry Rice mentality. Um, Very much like Jordan, just so maniacally competitive and driven and prone to creating things that aren't there and just insufferable. But Jerry and I are totally good now, and we've gone back and forth a lot, but did a book with him, like incredible. But like it made me feel good that he was the best because I saw he cared the most and worked the hardest and was the craziest. I was like, okay, and he's the best in practice. I'm like, it'd be a bummer if he wasn't also the best because like he's insane. So what happened was I got a blown up version of the actual printed photo that I was going to frame and give to my dad for Father's Day, which was coming up. You said that was in May. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to get Roger to sign it for, I'm not a big autograph guy, but like, I was like, I'm going to have Roger sign it for my dad. So Roger wrote, Steve, your son is slow, Roger Craig, which, my dad loved. My dad was a runner. And I'm like, I'll just get Jerry to sign it. And I walked up to Jerry after practice. He was sitting in his locker, and I just showed the picture. And before I could say anything, he looked at the picture and he just swore and just stormed off. I think the only conclusion is that he was very upset that it looked like I was beating him on this run. And I'm thinking, Jerry knows that I know that the world knows that he is a billion times faster than me and that this is not a real thing. And I think in the story I said this, but literally what was going through my head the whole time was, oh my God, if Jerry, I can't be so slow that that my heel clicks him. And I had this like horrible vision that I was going to be so slow that Jerry Rice was going to fall because of me and tear his ACL. And I would be the guy who, ruined Jerry Rice. So it was an incredible moment for me, though, because I was like, oh, God, he doesn't care. He's so furious just by looking at this picture that I can't even have the conversation with him. And, we were friends again the next day, but he didn't want to see me for the rest of the day. He was like, get out of my face.
You alluded to this earlier. One more step of your career I want to get to, and then we'll finish with the 3 questions I ask everybody. So, how did you get your job at Sports Illustrated?
Oh boy, well, it's kind of a long answer. I'll try to not go too long, but it is a crazy story. So, now fast forward to 1994. I'm a columnist at the Press Democrat, but still heavily focused on the Niners. I'm 29 by the end of that season, and I'm like, I should be at a better place. And I had discussions with the Chronicle, the Sacramento Bee, the San Jose Mercury News, among others. And by the way, I would have moved. So like, I'm not saying it had to be a Bay Area. Like, I would have gone to any, top category circulation paper for sure, because the Press Democrat was in the lower category, right? That middle one maybe. But like, if the Hartford Courant called or the, Columbus Dispatch, I mean, like really, it didn't have to be. I would have moved, and I was married, but my wife was in grad school. Like she probably would have gone with me. It would have been okay. But I had broken the story that Montana was going to get traded, which was kind of a big story, and it was going to be to one of 3 teams, the Chiefs, who ended up being the then Phoenix Cardinals or the Buccaneers. And I broke it cold for the Press Democrat, and a lot of the older writers who had been kind of maybe trying to help me get to their papers turned on me. And there was a stigma about me anyway, because, I came in and John McVay, the general manager, Seifert, Eddie DeBarlo, Carmen Policy, they all treated me really well, especially Eddie D, incredible owner. But like, it was going to be hard for me to compete against these guys like Ira Miller, who were really close with John McVay. And my only chance was to bro out with the players, especially the lesser known ones, and just hope they became good, And I was like chummy with the player guys. So they were already stigmatizing me, like, they used to say I high-fived the players, which I actually didn't. But once I heard that, I started like hugging players in front of people because I was a dick. But I was definitely a self-promoter because there was no internet and my paper was outside the circulation area. So I would make sure those clips got faxed in, or I would give copies of my stories to players. Like I wanted I definitely I would go on the radio, like I was trying to be noticed, but it just became like this toxic environment. I wasn't making very much money, and the workplace just started feeling really shitty. And I felt like I should have gotten something better. And I was like, you know what? This is not working for me. And both of my parents were labor lawyers. I they had a small firm in LA that was pretty successful. And my whole life I'd been knee jerk against going to law school. I was like, because I just, you're going to go to law school? A bunch of lawyers in my family. I was like, no, no. And it just occurred to me that I hadn't actually thought about whether I wanted to. I was just like, I just said no because I said no. And I was like, so I came up with this like I'll take the LSAT. I won't tell anyone except my wife and my parents, and I'll take the LSAT. I'll study for it. I'll apply. I'll defer. That'll buy me like more than a year and a half, and maybe I'll write a book. I don't know, but like I just got to shake it up. And so I took the LSAT, and back then you'd send away for applications, and you had to fill them out and send them back. So I was in the process of starting to apply. Um, well, it's November of 1994, and I'm in Detroit covering a Niners-Lions game. But in a weird foreshadowing of the type of thing I would do for SI, I had covered the Warriors in the 93-94 season as part of my columnist gig. I also had to be the Warrior beat writer, but we didn't travel except in the playoffs. So Chris Webber had been a rookie that they had traded a bunch of draft picks to take with the second pick, and had been a standout rookie. And back then you could get out of your rookie deal after a year, and there was weirdness going on with him and Don Nelson. So he was actually holding out of training camp. And before I even knew he was holding out, I had set up with Weber. Hey, can I just go after I do this Niners Lions game? I want to go hang out with your people in Detroit, see where you went to school, see your neighborhood, interview them, do the Chris Webber origin story. And he had kind of set me up that way. But now Chris Webber was there because he was holding out and disgruntled. So it was unbelievable. I like went and hung out with Chris Webber for days. And, my mom had been from Detroit and had moved as a teenager. And, we went back and saw my mom's old house, and Chris was like, man, you're going to have to vest up for this. And I was like, shut up. It's not that bad. And she would have gone to Mumford High, he was speaking at Mumford High. He didn't go to Mumford High because he went to, Country Day or whatever. But so I was like tripping around Detroit with Weber, getting good stuff. And I went and checked my message machine, I guess, back then at home on my work line. And it was Mike Bevins, who'd been like the number 4 guy at Newsday when I'd been an intern, and had tried to help me get jobs out of that internship. And he was this famously salty, kind of surly guy. And he had gone to Sports Illustrated. And the last time I'd seen him, a couple years earlier at a Super Bowl media room, it had gone so badly that I kind of like sincerely was like, hey, I'd love to send you some stuff and let you could tell me where I am. And he was like, just don't ask me for a fucking job. And I was like, oh God. And so out of the blue, Mike Bevins calls me, and I call him back from the hotel room, and he goes, hey, you still working for the Santa Maria Podunk Press or whatever the fuck it's called? And I'm like, yeah. And, he insulted me for about 10 minutes. And then he's like, well, look, we might be looking around, and I thought of you, and, I'd like you to send, he gave me a very specific instructions, about 20 clips, this many news, this many, and I was like, wow, if I leave the business, I'm at peace now, because at least I have one, Hail Mary home run shot of sending all my best stuff to Sports Illustrated, which is, the Mecca, and at the time was just full of monsters, and I was like, at least I could take one swing. And the rest, if it's a movie, it just goes into the sped up crazy montage. But next thing I know, Mark Mulvoy, the famous head of SI, is calling me up, and he's going to be in San Francisco. I'm going to be golfing with the mayor and some famous people and Rick Riley, and we're going to be. I actually didn't tell me he was going to be with Rick Riley. He's like, I want you to meet me at the Prescott Hotel. I'm going to barge in from the golf course at about 3 o'clock. So uh, here I am on a Friday in my suit, waiting for Mark Mulvoy, and uh, Riley walks in before him, and I didn't know Riley was golfing with him. And kind of, what are you doing here? I'm like, he goes, no, no. He's like, don't worry about it. I know what's going on. I'm like, okay. And it was like a dream, Mark Mulvoy loved my stuff. And, pretty much I was trying to accept the job on the spot, but he insisted that he wanted to fly me and my wife to New York and, give us a week long, go to Broadway and do the whole. I was like, okay. And he said everything I ever wanted to hear. And at one point he said, I asked myself, if this kid's so good, how come the Sacramento Union or the Sacramento Bee or the San Francisco Chronicle or the Examiner didn't give him a job? And then I realized those guys wouldn't know journalism if it bit them in the ass. And I'm like, oh my God. So next thing I knew, and it was this insane thing because I'm a huge Rolling Stones. I don't know if I can. There's a lot of Stones. There's
No,
Mick,
yeah.
and there's Mick and Keith up there. But I'm a huge Stones person, and that started from my dad when I was really little. And they were playing in '94 a show at the stadium in Oakland where the Raiders and A's used to play. And we had incredible tickets, and we had friends coming in from out of town. And, no texting or anything back then. So they were just waiting for me to get back from this interview in the city. And I come into our little 2-bedroom house in Oakland, and I'm wearing a suit, and I like walk to our back deck, and there's like, bong smoke, haze, beers. And I'm like, people are handing me drinks, and like, trying to take off my tie, and they're like, how'd it go? I'm like, I think I just got a job at Sports Illustrated. And so I always wondered if our seats were so good. I always wondered if Mick Jagger, at some point during that show, because I could have sworn at one point he kind of looked over and froze for a second. And he was like, why is that dude doing Mick Jagger for an entire show back at me? It is like it's a lot, but that was me, and I do a decent Mick, but that was me, like, riding the high of I just got my dream job out of nowhere, and I'm at the Stones, and I did start double fisting beers, and I got to a pretty good number by the time, let's just say that by the time, Gimme Shelter kicked the show into a new gear, I was in need of some shelter.
Mike, I can hear your stories for days, weeks, months. Luckily, we're colleagues, so I could always just slack you and you get a story. We'll wrap with two questions I'd like to ask everybody. The one is the through line from Mike Silver, late '80s, early '90s to now, and I want to bring up your book, your latest book, The Why Is Everything: A Story of Football, Rivalry, and Revolution. If you're
Now
watching
in
on YouTube,
paperback.
there it is
Yes.
now in paperback with a new epilogue. Correct.
Up through the 2024 season.
There you go. So folks could check that out. And Mike, I've read you since the minute I started probably reading Sports Illustrated, and certainly started covering the NFL. And the way that you were able to earn the trust of the biggest power brokers in our sport and get behind the scenes and places that people can't get to and tell those stories. It's what you've become known for so many years. I'm curious that through line though, from like when you first started to now. Like what did you learn then in those early internships and jobs that still matter for you to produce the type of work that you've produced for so long?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I always date it back to like, okay, so I grew up in LA and went to public schools, and there was a mandatory desegregation court order in effect still, that integrated our schools. And I was very lucky in that we basically had kids bust into our junior high and high school on the west side, and I didn't have to get on a bus. So it's easy for me to, talk about how great it was. But I mean, it was amazing. We had fully integrated schools from the time I was in seventh grade. So, what a what a beautiful thing for a kid to experience, because any stereotype or bigoted sentiment or bullshit, trope out there was immediately dispelled by reality, because we were all going to school together. We're like, nah, like kids are kids, and we all had our feuds and stuff, but it was not, wasn't easy to categorize based on some, stupid classification like that. And to the point of journalism, I in the dorms, we didn't have football dorms at Cal, so I lived with football players across the hall and next door. I obviously, um, you know, when I start covering the 49ers, there are a ton of black players, and I felt like I had an advantage from the start, because there were a lot of, because our industry was not very integrated. And in fact, my senior honors thesis at Cal, with Dr. Harry Edwards as the sponsor, was about racism in the sports media, because his point was, hey, you guys are all up in arms about Al Campanis. Look in the mirror at your own industry. And, you know, and while, like Brian Burwell, the late Brian Burwell, Wilbon, like those guys used to take me under their wing, and I'm so grateful to what I got to learn from them as a young writer. But they were the anomaly. Jared Bell was on the beat with me, but it was really, really white and male and pretty old. And I noticed early, and again, I had to find an edge somehow, and it wasn't going to be GMs and scouts and coaches. Now I'm old, so I hang out with the old people more. But I had to try to go for it with the players, and I was not. I was more comfortable around black people than most of the people I saw. And I also think the LA thing, because of LA and celebrity and maybe my self-absorption and arrogance, if you put all that together, I was like, dude, you're not more important. I mean, I wasn't awed by the celebrity as much, because I was just used to going to school with celebrities' kids or whatever, whatever. So all that put together, I felt like gave me an edge. And then the other thing that really helped me, and as it was changing, was, what I was taught in junior high and high school, working on the school paper, was don't, be an impassive, detached, objective observer. Do not inject yourself into the story. Nobody wants to hear about you. You're not the story, and it's not objective. And I kind of grew up, looking at Hunter S. Thompson and Tom Wolfe and all these people who were diving in and getting embedded and being part of the story. And at some point, I just made the decision where I was like, I don't know if I'm buying objectivity as something I can really do. I can be fair and accurate to a fault, and I will be. But if I can get in, by definition, it's going to impact me by who I get close to and who's letting me in. But it's worth it if I can get in and tell you what's really going on with this immediacy. And so I was going for that more. And so I was trying to do it, as you said, like running the hills or whatever at a newspaper, and doing the hardest job in the world, which I still would say is a beat writer is by far the hardest job. But when I got to SI, back then, people wanted to give SI access, a lot of people. And I was like, oh my God, I have to take advantage of this now, because I can, and because I have to belong on the page when every guy, every person I read in this magazine, I'm like, well, I can't write, I can't write like Steve Rushin or Scott Price or Richard Hoffer or Gary Smith, or, I'm like, there's just no way. It's not, I'm not going to be able to get by. I think I was writing okay, but I was like, I gotta get in. And so, and I was young, and and I listen, my wife and I have had many, many conversations over the years, because we met in college, and she's fun, and she was home taking care of young kids, and she would say, you know, do you really have to be out till 3:30 a.m. really, and come home destroyed? Do you really have to be calling me from bars? And I was like, look, there's a tangible reason why it helps me, but there's an intangible too, right? Like if I have been out with you late and trusting each other and never write about any of the stuff because it just turned out we didn't talk about stuff. If I have to go up to you 2 years later in a crowded locker room and be like, dude, what happened in the huddle over there? We're communicating on a different level than we otherwise would be. And even sometimes it never pays off tangibly. But to me, that was work ethic. Although I'll leave you, my wife one time in the Rodman era, because I did a book with Rodman after the SI thing, and you know, my wife one time was like, "Why do I remember vividly?" She's like, kind of mad, and she's like, "Why do I have the husband who's on a party bus with Dennis Rodman? Why do I have the husband who's calling me from a bar at 3 in the morning so loud that he can't hear me?" And she's I looked at her and I go, "Hey, at what point did I ever give you the impression that I was not a partier?" And to her credit, she started laughing. And I was like, when you looked at me and I was down on one knee proposing, were you looking at a guy going home at 11? I don't think so. But yeah, to me, that was work ethic. I was like, and it wasn't always partying, but I mean, like I went to church with Kurt Warner. I'll never forget, you know, in the heyday of the greatest show on turf, the Friday night before a big playoff game, and I was very close to Marshall Faulk and very close to Kurt Warner, who had very different approaches to Friday night before a playoff game. And I went to church with Kurt, but it was a fundamentalist church that was like 3.5 hour services, like, very different from the house of worship that either I was used to as a kid, being raised Jewish, or my Catholic wife. Both of those were like, it's going to be an hour, it's going to be reverential, and it's going to be, this was like 25-piece band and people speaking in tongues. So I went with Kurt and Brenda and their kids to church, but I dipped out like 2 hours in. And Kurt was like, busting my chops about it incessantly. Like, oh, what are you gonna do? You gonna go out with Marshall? And I'm like, yeah. And he goes, oh, you couldn't even stay for the whole church. And I said, do you think I should have like gone out with Marshall for happy hour, gotten hammered, and then come to the end of church? Like I have to do it this way. And then I got to the bar and, trying to catch up to Marshall and his crew, grabbing drinks, and Marshall the whole time was like, "Can you believe this fucking guy? He went to church with Kurt," and everyone's like, "Ah, yeah," And I'm like, "Okay, well," but yeah, no, I just, to me, I'm trying. When I was covering the 49ers as a beat writer, the access was better back then, and the players and reporters parked in the same parking lot out in front of the facility, and so one of the other beat writers and we got this little mini football, and we'd go out and throw the ball in the parking lot and fuck around, and drive our editors crazy because our stories would come in later, on time, didn't miss deadline, but later. But people were like, why are you guys dicking around the parking lot? And sure, we might see a player come out and have a conversation with them and get some information, but largely our thought was, if these guys see us as human beings who are fucking, like, Montana back to pass on, like, not almost crashing into a car and just being idiots, there's value in that too, because now, they're not just seeing us as people hovering over them, trying to find out if they're, if it's the left knee or the right knee or whatever. So I always, I think the most important things are work ethic, and that might be part of it, toughness, and that is, as you know, man, it's just, we have to be in some situations that are, kind of brutal sometimes, with large people who could crush us. And, it's just part of the job. You got to be disliked at times. And I don't think any of us thinks it's fun, but, it's just part of journalism. And then, people slash interviewing skills. But, part of that is, and people always go, what's the best part of the job? I'm like, not having to be in an office is definitely the best part for sure. And then, well, what's the worst? And I'm always like, oh, having to, swallow your dignity and push yourself nerve wise in a way that you never would in real life. Like, please, Peyton Manning, can I come hang out with you? I just want to go to the dry cleaners with you. Oh, come on, please, please. Like in real life, I'd be like, I don't want to I don't want to make this celebrity have me tag along with them. Like that is so gross and awkward. But like, you've got to not only be able to try to find connection, but you got to be a pest in a way that is sometimes very cringeworthy, and it's a hard line. So, uh, but those are all really important parts of it, and I want to recognize when I say this that it has gotten appreciably harder uh, for everyone to get that access or to make those connections than it was before. And I'm still trying to fight the good fight, but I have a lot of advantages because of my past. But like, I want to say on the record, like what you are doing right now is the hardest thing in my opinion. Um, and I just hope people who don't have to do that anymore because they got put into a role like me, like don't lose sight of that. Like, and by the way, when I roll in as a national person and I see that look from the beat people, like, oh fuck, this guy's gonna get ushered in and go get Travis Kelsey alone. I not only understand it, but like I get it too because I used to be the same way. Like, oh my God, Rick Riley's here and he's got his arm on Tim Harris, and they're gonna go out to the bar, and and I'm just sitting here trying to get Steve Bono quotes in a scrum in the locker room. What the hell? But it's definitely gotten harder.
Well, Mike, I'm actually skipping the last question because you covered it. Because I was going to ask about some of your advice, and I think you hit a lot there. And yeah, we were recording this in mid-December. I will be seeing you next Sunday night for Bears 49ers. I will not give you
Yes.
a dirty look when the national reporter comes into the press box as we get set for a big game.
Would you give me a dirty look if like Ben Johnson was walking with me to the bus with his arm around me, like saying something? No, I'm kidding. I don't think that'll happen anyway, but I do think you're going to help me understand that team you're covering because I saw them week one
You did,
on the
yeah.
Monday night game, and there were times where Caleb looked really good and they looked good, and there were times where it just looked really bad. And I know the defense hasn't been as highly rated as the typical Bears defense in some ways, and there are a lot of questions I have about how good they are still, but I mean, the record is the record, and the record says they probably win the division if they will have beaten the Packers, which apparently will have already happened. But they're right in that mix, and more power to them, man. I applaud them for being right in that mix.
Well, if you get that walk to the bus with Ben Johnson, I'll be slightly jealous, but it'll be much better because you're my teammate now. So that's
For
a
sure.
win for the Athletic to get that.
We
So
are
Mike,
we
yeah,
we roll strong on the
yes,
Bears beat. Like we're not messing around. So I'm just gonna try to add what I can. But you guys are there's some serious and it wouldn't be Starsky and Hutch. What's a good Chicago show? But
you can call
there's
it
a
Dan and I.
dynamic.
Yeah, right, the Blues Brothers. There you go. How about that?
Yeah, you're the Blues Brothers. Was Hill
Yeah,
Street Blues Chicago? I can't remember,
uh,
but
yeah.
maybe not. But yeah, you're the Blues Brothers. Yeah, I don't
There
know
we
if
go.
you're Belushi or Aykroyd, but either way, it's a good thing to be.
There we go. Well, Mike, I've been a fan of yours for a long time. It's very fun to be your colleague, and it was great to get to hear your story. And thank you for coming on and telling our listeners how you broke in.
Thank you, Kevin. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I'm other than getting mentioned by Marcus Thompson on a previous episode, this is as good as it gets.